Thank you, Abe, and I'm delighted with the great support KDI is giving to this very serious, I think, intellectual enterprise where we're trying to bring together academics on four coordinated topics. This is the one closest to my heart, and I'm pleased to have with me talented group of people who are really expert on talking about the national identity. And here we're taking a rather triangular perspective overall. Although our first presenter, Bill Callahan, who's the chair of international politics and China studies at the University of Manchester and co-director of the British University China Center, will be leading us by talking specifically about some Chinese themes of identity. He will soon be the chair of the International Relations Program at LSE. He has written 3 books, third about to come out just in the last few years, that really have been path-breaking in their interpretation of Chinese national identity. First talking about balancing pessimism and optimism, then an edited book on how China orders the world, and a new one on the China dream, very timely, as Xi Jinping has embraced that concept very strongly. Our second presenter will be Ming from George Mason University, where he's a professor of government and politics. He has a PhD from government at Harvard. He's been a postdoctoral fellow and fellow at various institutes, and just came off of 2 years in Tokyo, where he was a visiting professor at Cato University. And he's written, I believe, the most, the deepest, the most well understood book on Chinese-Japanese relations, emphasizing the national identity perspective, giving the really interpretations of what's gone on over at least 4 decades, and also many specific pieces where he's filled in gaps, understanding Sino-Japanese relations, among many other things he's written. And finally, our third presenter is Byun, who is a graduate student at GW, where she has a master's after getting a master's from Yonsei and a BA from Brown University. But she's no ordinary graduate student. She comes across as already not just an established scholar, and her connection to the Pacific Forum, CSIS, is just one indication of that, but as the person who's done much of the most interesting work on Sino-South Korean relations for a number of years. She publishes widely, and we will turn to her work as the work that really consider the analysis that gets at this issue in depth, often jointly with Scott Snyder. So this is the panel I'm really pleased to be moderating. My own background is many years at Princeton University, and from which I will retire officially this June. And but now I'm in DC and finding a lot of things there to be busy dealing with issues like this. I want to introduce the national identity topic briefly before we turn to our presenters. It is really a quest for uniqueness, pride, and often superiority. And the concept of national identity gaps, I think, is one that should be added to the jargon. It's really discourse that talks about the divisions between two countries. So it has really 3 Ds to it. One is discourse. You really focus on what countries are saying. The next thing is to make it specific, to make it a basis for serious analysis and comparison. You need dimensions. What are the many dimensions of identity? And my paper in particular will talk about 6 dimensions that I've been using in my analysis. And finally, the third D is dichotomies. What we really see happening in these identity discussions in East Asia, especially, is the sense that it's us versus them. It's a sharp dichotomy. It's a zero-sum game. Your identity is shaped in contrast to the other. And so, what I think the theme that is emerging here is, and it coincides with the notion, let's start with China and let's focus on Chinese national identity as seen by the other countries, is that China is the driving force in the national identity discourse. South Korea has been obsessed with Japan. Japan is now undergoing the sway of increasing identity concerns and attention to identity issues related to its neighbors. But it's really China, as you read this discourse, that's the eye-opener. What has China been saying? And I spent a year at the Woodrow Wilson Center recently and just immersed myself in Chinese sources on all the identity things I was interested in. And I really was startled at how abruptly Chinese identity has been transformed since 2009. And those are the themes. And so, but I want to make sure that we also bring in Russia, because it has a pivot to Asia. There's a kind of Putinism involved. And so I'll be talking a good deal about the Russian element, because today, of course, Xi Jinping is visiting Moscow in a visit that has more significance than I think people are aware. And I'll come up with that as the final presentation here. But first, we'll start with Bill.
Thank you, Gil, and I want to thank you and the AI for inviting me to do this. I guess I need to know how to call it. Right. As Gil mentioned, I've just finished a book that looks at Chinese identity politics called "The Shameless Notion that China Dreams 20 Visions of the Future." The timing of the book is quite funny because, as he said, it was not a central topic really until Xi Jinping raised it at the end of November in a speech at the National History Museum. So my book is very timely, but it's also not so timely because it's coming out next Friday, so it's not here today. So thank my editor about that. And in looking at this identity politics, what I've been doing is exploring the theme and the issue of values. And values have become a really big issue, a key topic in the past few years, especially since 2009. And what I've been doing is looking at how Chinese elites are talking about values, about their values, other values, and they typically talk about them in terms of national space, national values, Chinese values versus American values. What I see them doing is trying to convert economic power into political power. And now we've achieved all these great things with 3 decades of economic reform. How can we get real power? How can we be a big voice, be a great power on the world stage? And one of the answers to this is they're saying China has to promote Chinese values on the world stage. And the way they set it up is in terms of what Gil was saying, in terms of dichotomies and oppositions. So Chinese values are as opposed to Western values. And as I'll be kind of narrating over the next couple of minutes, what they're doing is not discovering Chinese values and discovering Western values, but creating Western values as the opposite of Chinese values. That none of these values actually are as stable or as sure as they're presented. So what I'm doing is kind of exploring how we need to unpack how these values came into being. My argument is, as I said, is that these values have been created quite recently, and that they've been created quite recently as this new cocktail, this new mix of traditional Chinese values, usually Confucianism, and socialism, very modern socialism. So it's not a transition from communism to nationalism, as we often hear, but it's actually a mix of them. That it's both Confucianism and socialism, and it's neither Confucianism nor socialism, as we usually understand them. And the result is that there's this urge to create an exceptionalism, a Chinese exceptionalism. This Chinese exceptionalism only makes sense when it's contrasted against the West, what I call an occidentalized West, a West that's created as the other. So Occidentalism here is like Orientalism, but in reverse. It's where these voices in Beijing are creating the West as dysfunctional, as an evil, as a weak place, in order to manage foreign and domestic critics. It's trying to manage what these critics who are pushing for more liberal economic reforms, political reforms are doing by devaluing their comments by saying that they're foreigners, and therefore illegitimate comments. So, just in a nutshell, the arguments that I've been looking at generally are quite simple when you boil them down. That for China to be good, the West has to be evil, and that's what I've been looking at: is good versus evil discourse. So identity gaps. What this is doing is what Professor Rozman is talking about in terms of creating an identity gap, and it has I think quite a strong influence and impact on China's relations with the U.S. and with China's Asian neighbors. And this identity gap can be seen in discussions of the China model, the China dream, and the China experience and China conceptualism. And when they talk about the China model, it's almost inevitably juxtaposed against some American model, which we actually hadn't heard of before. This American model is kind of created. And so what they're doing is, as I said, trying to convert their economic power into political power by proposing a China that is unique, that's holistic, that's superior. So the difference between China being different and China being exceptional, much like with the U.S., is that it's not just unique, it's uniquely superior to other countries. So it's building up a hierarchical relation of nations that will, in a few minutes, we'll say, has impact on its views of its East Asian neighbors. So to trace this shift from economic to political discourse into moral discourse, I decided to kind of look in a new place. Usually you look at the political scientists, the international relations people, the officials, who are always talking about China as a moral force for good. I thought it would be actually more interesting to look at how economists are discussing these issues. So what I did was look at how these economists start off talking in terms of economic theory, in terms of development issues, about getting rid of alleviating rural poverty. But then, over the past few years, they've shifted from these economic concerns to political and moral concerns. And I think this is important because, on the one hand, these economists actually are very influential for state policy in China and now abroad as well, because they work in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And secondly, it gives a sense of the tone of the values debate. I'm not looking at the extremes of the values debate. I'm looking at kind of the mainstream actors in this to get a sense of how it's influential. And I saw, so there's one shift from economic to political and moral discourse. This is involved in another shift, and this is where I had to convince Gil, actually, is that it's a shift from nationalism to statism. I think that statism and nationalism overlap to some extent, but it's important to make a distinction. So I'll see if I can convince you today. And that the values are not, that are being promoted are not primarily civilizational or having to do with culture, but they're about the state and about strengthening the state. So there's nothing peculiarly Chinese about this. It's about a hierarchical society that values stability and unity. You can find in other countries and other continents as well. There's also a shift in how we think about the values when we talk about values, often it's a fundamentalist or fundamental view of values that distinguishes Chinese values from foreign values. But in doing my reading, I found that whenever people talk about the China dream, they're almost always talking about the American dream. There's always this distinction. There's this conversation going on that's often unacknowledged between the China dream and the American dream, between Chinese exceptionalism and American exceptionalism. And my point is that they're interwoven. And we'll talk about how they're interwoven in a moment. And the third shift is in foreign policy, which I don't think it's kind of controversial to say that Chinese foreign policy in the past 4 years or so has shifted from being primarily defensive to being more offensive or more active. It's shifted from being focused really razor sharp on how China can benefit from the world in terms of its domestic economic development. It's shifted from that to more questions about China as a world power, China as a superpower that shapes values. So, I'll just quickly go through the three economists that I looked at. There's a lot more details in the paper. I looked at Justin Byun because he's an official or semi-official view. He was at Peking University. He was an advisor for the government. He's one of the people who would write the 5-year plans. And then in 2008, he became the vice president and chief economist of the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And what I thought was interesting about his various work, his writings and speeches, is how he's going against this trend, going against the fundamentalist trend, because he's always about mixing and matching. Perhaps that's because he's from Taiwan originally. He's kind of this mixing and matching hybrid Chinese guy. And if you look at his theory, his economic theory, he's critical of state-centric theory, and he's critical of market fundamentalism as well. So he doesn't like either of them, but he doesn't discard either of them either. He combines them into his new model, which he does not call the China model. It's a new structural economics. And so he's kind of a test case against which I contrast the other two economists. So Huang Gang is, I think, in a way, the next generation after Justin Lin, in that he is also hugely important in Beijing, and he's the guy who writes the 5-year plans now. He's also a public intellectual who's talking about a wide range of issues. And he's been publishing books in the past couple of years, including a translation in English that came out, I guess, 2 years ago. That was book China in 2020. And what he's doing is he starts off as a good economist talking about quantitative issues and development rates and poverty reduction. But he very quickly goes to what I would call quantitative issues of how we can pass the U.S. So that's his main goal, not necessarily alleviating poverty anymore, but to pass the U.S. He's going from this developmental economics to geopolitics. And I thought that was quite interesting because he doesn't have to do that. He's an economist. But he chose to go into this geopolitical way of understanding Chinese development. And he goes on to frame the U.S. not just as an economic competitor, but as a moral problem, that the U.S. is evil, that the Washington consensus is not just a bad road, which is what Justin Lin would say, it's the evil road. And the China road is the solution to this. Not just for China, but I think he said it for everyone. And his goal, again, is to is moving beyond China having rural development and economic growth for the benefit of the Chinese people to think about a new Sino-centric world. This is what he predicts for 2030, the book that came out last year. And he deploys certain concepts, Chinese concepts, great harmony, which all three of them do, Justin Lin, Huang Gang, and Han Wei, who have this very vague, very popular notion of utopia in China. Han Wei, who's a political science person at Peking University, within the China, director of the China and the World Center there. he kind of really pushes this identity gap to its farthest point, where his book, the edited book, The China Model, has a lot of things, a lot of its main arguments. One of its main arguments is to revalue the first 30 years, the so-called Maoist period in China, to say that it's necessary and good, and that Mao is good too. And he's also at the same time giving a very sharp distinction between China and the West. His long, it was an 8-page introduction. That's one of the other main themes, is that the West is evil and the democracy is a trap. That democracy is a trap, the West is setting to invade China. These are influential works, so that's why we have to take them seriously. And I think that's part of what I would call China's exceptionalist dream. And of course, these aren't the only voices. There are voices pushing for liberalism or for socialism. But the dominant view is this state-centric Chinese exceptionalism that I've been talking about. And that the whole discourse of the rejuvenation of China that Xi Jinping said is China's dream, I think is the expression of this. So that China is no longer, it's best not to understand it as a nation state, but better to understand it as a party state or a civilization state, an empire state, an enterprise state. These are the ways that Chinese books are talking about China now. I guess my main point is that there's been this shift from an internally directed nationalism to a more globally focused exceptionalism, state-centric exceptionalism. And here I'm following the lead of a historian in Shanghai, Su Jilin, who's talked about the collective right turn of China's intelligentsia. People who were liberals in the 80s and nationalists in the 90s, in the 2000s, he said they're all stages. He makes a good argument for that, I think. And the result is that there's this increasingly essentialized and exceptionalist view of China versus the world. The zero-sum identity politics is framing a zero-sum notion of international relations and conflict with the U.S. and Asian countries. So, to conclude, I would say that this new statism, this new exceptionalism, is growing out of China's negative interaction with the West. And is producing what we would call an unbridgeable identity gap. And you can see this in another book that came out 2 years ago now, Zhang Weiwei's book, The China Shock, where he occidentalizes not just the West, but other Asian countries. And it's really quite interesting how he talks about them. It's a way of criticizing democracy and criticizing liberalism in general. He says that the Asian countries' problems, which are quite diverse, all come from adopting what he calls the flawed Western model of democracy. And his solution, Zhang's solution, is that they need to return to the warm embrace of Chinese civilization. And I thought that was quite interesting because his main criticism of democracies in Asia is that they're low quality, which is a very good Chinese phrase, low quality. But I thought it was quite interesting that it's okay for Korea, for example, to be a low quality Confucian state, kind of a derivative version of Confucianism compared to China, but it's not okay for it to be some low quality, some other ideology. My solution, since I was asked or tasked with giving policy recommendations, which I'm not very good at, my solution, I guess, is to try and come at this from a vantage point that calls the whole debate into question, and critique both this notion of universal, whether it's capitalism or some other universal, and while at the same time criticizing essentialist views of identity in China. Chinese civilization. And rather than looking for values that are promoted by the government, which is what Dan Shui-Tong told me last week, that the Chinese government needs to get some values and promote them. Rather than doing it like that, I think it's better to develop and promote shared values by looking to shared experiences. Okay, we'll stop there.
Okay, first I want to thank the for your invitation, and this is very exciting. I also want to thank you for that very generous introduction. My paper is about the Japanese view of the Sino-U.S. national identity gap. And in this paper, I'm mainly focusing on that part, not really the Japanese view of Sino-Japanese interaction in national identity. And I did a paper with Gil, and it just came out, so I really don't want to repeat it in this chapter. Just a few words about my research for this paper. The national identity gap is really Gil's intellectual contribution. So not surprisingly, Japanese normally don't frame the discussion in that respect. Of course, they talk about the difference or similarities between Chinese and Americans, and by scattered and in different ways. So there is not a very body belief here. So what I've done is to essentially construct what I think is the Japanese view on the difference between the Americans and the Chinese, and use it to explain some of the foreign policy behavior. So my research is based on reading newspapers and weekly. I spent 2 years in Japan, watching TV programs and talking to friends, formally, informally. And normally, actually, hear more about identity discourse in private conversation. Internet is even better. It's very short. It's all about identity. We Japanese are this. The Chinese, similar in the Chinese website or American website. And but I don't really do internet discussion that much. I pretty much focus on the mainstream views. And the first part of the paper is really a very quick summary of the Japanese view of the Sino-U.S. identity gap through the 2000s. Unfortunately, there are no good tracking poles to show how Japanese think about it. We have some sort of tracking poles that are not ideal, but may give us some idea where things are. Actually, I've done the top one. That was my fault. Here's the figure. See, this is the poll done by the Japanese Prime Minister's office about Japanese sense of unity. And the top is the United States. Japanese feel very close for the United States. Actually, now it's 84.5%. I don't know how much higher it can go. This is until after Operation Tornado. The blue line is China. It used to be very, very similar to the Americans in the 1980s. Now it's about 18%, sorry. And you may even go down a little bit further. Then that means that the Japanese completely disattached, right? And because if you take into consideration statistical discrepancy. I think that was what you can see from this sort of tracking poll is that the difference between sensitive difference and substantive distance. You can sort of essentially argue that the Japanese view of China was just too rosy in the 1970s, 1980s. They really shouldn't have such a positive view of China. China just came out of a disastrous cultural revolution. You can also argue that maybe their view of China now is too negative. Maybe it's shooting in a different direction. It's not very clear whether we can equate Japanese sense of unity with either China or the United States as sort of identity, right? And for example, it may be the case that they like the United States not because they think Japanese and Americans are very similar, but for other reasons, right? Anecdotal evidence seems to suggest that. And so I have to use some other sources to sort of essentially get to the Japanese views. And not surprisingly, Japanese identities are very complex and evolving and sometimes conflicting with each other. And I focus on sort of two prominent national identity-driven orientations so that we can sort of at least talk about. One is this notion that Japan was a bridge between China and the United States. The other was the identity that Japan was an ally for both China and the United States. I think for a long time, since the end of the Second War, because the Japanese policy community is often imagined Japan to be a natural bridge between China and the United States. the reason, of course, is that a part of it makes sense. Japan was an Asian country, but also the first modern state in Asia. So in that sense, that Japanese could essentially imagine themselves knowing both was better than both the United States and China on the other side. And in some way, this kind of imagination was convenient for both international relations and domestic politics. Right? Who doesn't want to be a bridge? And if we use the network analysis that's fashionable now, essentially anybody wants to be a hub or bridge, and that will give you some competitive advantage. And I would also argue that imagining Japan as a bridge between China and the United States, and was also well-intentioned. It means that Japan wanted to connect the two parties in a positive direction. You can imagine that if Japan wants to imagine Japan to be a bridgehead for the United States Asia, then that would be a very different intention expressed. I think apart from that, this is identity. In reality, as I argued in chapter, actually both Americans and Chinese did not necessarily think they needed Japan to deal with each other. That they could deal with each other directly, and they also thought they understood each other. In foreign policy practice, foreign countries rarely use Tokyo as the base for their discussion about sensitive issues. This is about identity. The second sort of identity-oriented base orientation is this notion that Japan may be an outlier. And this is particularly prominent in the 1990s. This was a sense that particularly in informal conversation, sometimes even informal dialogues, Japanese began to sort of talk about the Chinese and Americans were actually quite similar to each other in some personality traits, communication styles, and logic, or sense of universal values, whatever. And this was also the period when Japanese were worried about Japan passing. The notion that now the United States was going to pay more attention to China and Japan would be left outside. And of course, they also tapped into this long-established school in Japan about the Japanese uniqueness. In the sense that Japan had an older culture. Even though Americans and Chinese were different in their universal claims, but they were similar, as both sort of had this exceptionalist claim that they represented a world system. Japan, on the other hand, was quite different. If you look at the current situation for the past few years, and there have been some changes. And Callahan poll, this is a new poll, just for the first time they asked the Japanese to compare China vis-a-vis the United States. They also asked Chinese their view vis-a-vis the United States. So this is the first time I had sort of trilateral poll. Now, surprisingly, both Chinese and Japanese like U.S. better than the other side. Japanese like U.S. even more. Chinese like U.S. a little bit less, but they don't like Japan that much. And the poll also asked people some questions why that was the case. As I won't go into the details here, but it's certainly related to identity. For example, part of the reason the Japanese don't like China that much is territory dispute. Surprise. Right? But interestingly, different from the government position, most Japanese think there is a territory dispute. That's a fact. Right? The government possesses the reason. And they also think that a major reason why they don't like China that much because the Chinese keep criticizing Japan over the history. But the history itself is not the problem. It's the Chinese criticism of the history. Now, surprisingly, the Chinese think that Japanese past aggression is very much the source of this tension. And that sort of poll did not ask how about sort of the trend between Chinese and Americans, but you can give us some sort of sense. And to complement that, I'll be reading the Japanese newspapers and watch TV, and I won't go into detail, but my finding is this. Different from the previous period, and the Japanese are no longer that worried about Sino-U.S. tension. They used to be worried. If there was too much tension, that would be bad for Japan, but now they don't worry about it. In fact, they would rather see some tension between China and the United States. And to some extent, they also sort of, they are also hoping to drive that. In fact, you can see more and more efforts essentially to frame the issue in such a way that the Americans would be alerted to their fundamental difference from the Chinese. Certainly, this is related to the policy expediency, but it's also sort of identity. But the Japanese national identity formation is very complex, and what fascinated me is that if you sort of go below that surface, you also see some other trends that are happening. One interesting trend, in my view, is that you really don't see that much effort at Americanization, even though Japanese love America. But they don't want to, they are not learning, adapting to the American institution and practice right now, except in the national security area. I think they want to copy the National Security Council. But other than that, essentially, I think that in terms of economic area, it's pretty much stopped in the mid-2000s with Koizumi. In fact, most Japanese blame the reform as the reason why you see this increasing polarization. Even in the political arena, and a lot of people blame DPJ politicians for adopting sort of Western institution like British system in terms of two-party system, and the politicians should dominate over bureaucrats. And so you see that sort of discourse. And so instead, when the Japanese think about reform, they are talking about Meiji heroes, and they are not talking about American occupation. Even though from my perspective, the American occupation has profoundly affected Japanese institutions. But of course, in their imagination, the Japanese typically talk about Meiji heroes. And that's where it gets interesting, even though people don't like China that much. But you can also identify almost there is this sort of subconscious adaptation to the Chinese system. Some Japanese scholars have talked about some of the Japanese reformers like Hashimoto Toru, the mayor of Osaka, stated essentially sort of some of their reform, the thrust reform is very, very similar to the Chinese system. Essentially, it's meritocracy, controlled political leadership, decisive decision-making style, but market and economy. Of course, this is an imagination. Whether China actually had meritocracy in the past or not, it's a different question. So you see this sort of a conflicting twist. Right now, it seems that I think the nationalist vision is prevailing. Essentially, this Prime Minister Abe's vision of beautiful Japan, going back to Japanese own truths, own roots. But my point is simply that you can sort of also see how the possibility for different national identity and how they can imagine this, and they are. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What do you want to do next?
So I want to first thank Professor Rozman and everyone at KEI for putting together this panel and having me participate in this book project. I look at South Korea's identity gap with China across different dimensions of identity. So the second thing that Professor Rozman referred to in his introduction. So I look at the identity gap across different dimensions that suggests conflicting or competing forces of alignment between China and the U.S. I focus mainly on the recent period of regional tensions from 2009 and the Inyongbak period, and have two main points. The first is that there's been a negative shift in South Korean views towards China during this period from 2009 that has resulted in a widening of South Korea's identity gap with China, and a focus on the broader strategic implications of China's rise. And this contrasts with earlier South Korean views of China as an economic opportunity, especially since 2001, after 2001. And the second point that I want to make is, in contrast to what Professor Ming just suggested as Japanese preferences for U.S.-China competition, in South Korea, at the same time as this downturn in attitudes towards China, there's also been a recognition of the dangers of a widening of U.S.-China differences in the region, especially since the global financial crisis. And this has heightened South Korea's key strategic dilemma of managing both strong economic ties with China and strong security ties with the U.S. And in policy terms, has also implied an effort to move away from the traditional strategy of hedging toward a focus on building new diplomatic capacities as a middle power and network power that was briefly mentioned here as well. And before I move on to the different dimensions of identity, I just want to highlight some main public opinion trends in South Korea to show the relationship between South Korean public views towards China and the U.S. The first big trend is 2004 marked the turning point towards a negative direction of South Korean public views towards China, with the impact of the Korea history issue. And public opinion polls in the immediate period before 2004 actually show that views towards China were more favorable than views toward the U.S. in general. And as I mentioned, 2009 is you see a sort of second point where you see a significant dip in favorable attitudes towards China. The second big trend in public opinion is this decline in favorable attitudes towards China has been accompanied by an increase in favorable views towards the U.S. So this zero-sum view of the U.S.-China relationship in the South Korean case sort of translates into a zero-sum view of South Korea's relationship with China and South Korea's relationship with the United States. So I look at 5 different aspects of national identity. The first two are, first, the historical identity gap, and second, territorial and other sort of traditional security issues shaping identity perceptions. The South Korean perceptions of Chinese historical and territorial sovereignty have raised suspicions about China's long-term intentions in the region as a rising challenger to the U.S. So South Korean reactions to these claims have arguably been the strongest in terms of identity because they relate to not just what the South Korean conservative media refers to as Chinese historical imperialism, but also relate to perceptions of Chinese visions of the future of the peninsula. For example, the ongoing Korea issue and recent Chinese narratives on the Korean War around the same time as the power transition in North Korea drew these type of reactions and also showed the tensions between South Korea's historical relationship with China as a tributary state and subject of great power competition on the one hand versus South Korea's contemporary image as global Korea, or what Ming promoted as global Korea. As for territorial issues, although China's recent territorial disputes in the region and criticism of the alliance shaped images of China as an assertive power, at the same time, South Korea has also sought to avoid taking sides in the U.S.-China security dispute in an effort to balance alliance solidarity with the U.S. and pragmatic cooperation with China. The third aspect of identity is the North Korea factor, which is the most important factor that constitutes South Korean identity as a U.S. military ally. And given stalled inter-Korean relations, China's political and economic engagement with the North Korean regime has raised concerns about South Korea's declining relative influence while reinforcing Cold War divisions. And this was, of course, most evident in 2009-2010 with North Korean military provocations, which was also a period of marked increase in Sino-U.S. diplomatic and economic exchanges relative to inter-Korean exchanges. The fourth aspect of identity, the political identity gap with China, reinforces the distinction between South Korea's relationships with China and the U.S. in terms of political systems and values. For example, U.S.-South Korea joint society responses to North Korean human rights issues have focused attention on common shared democratic values underlying the U.S.-Korea alliance versus China's violation of international norms. And for example, last year in Blue House press conference remarks by Lee Pak, he publicly called for Chinese compliance with international norms in reference to China's reported repatriation of North Korean refugees at the time. And this also reflected sort of the growing impact of public opinion and public pressure on China policy in Korea, especially after the Callahan incident. The final aspect of identity is economic identity. And unlike the political and security relationship, South Korea's economic ties with China have positively contributed to South Korea's economic identity as an advanced player in the global economy. But South Korea's increasingly asymmetric economic dependence on China, as well as China's rising competitiveness in South Korea's key export markets, have driven broader concerns about South Korean subordination and also the potential economic costs of conflict. And related to last night's KEI panel on the China-Korea-Japan FTA, if you look at the regional trade patterns over the past 2 decades, there's clearly a shift in South Korea's relative trade dependence from the U.S. to China around 2003-2004 in terms of both the proportion of bilateral trade in total foreign trade and the proportion of bilateral trade in South Korea's GDP. And so South Korea's bilateral FTA and the trilateral FTA with Japan, China, and South Korea highlights sort of the functional interests that weigh in on South Korean identity perceptions as an Asian power, and also shape South Korea's orientation between China-centered economic regionalism and versus this network of U.S. bilateral alliances. So to conclude, if I have time, to conclude with prospects under the Park Geun-hye administration, since her election campaign, her prioritization of one, engaging North Korea, and two, strengthening partnership with China seem to present favorable conditions for narrowing the identity gap with China. And of course, I wrote this conclusion before the third nuclear test last month. So given continued aggression under Kim Jong-un, the Xi Jinping leadership's responses to North Korea and the U.S.-South Korea alliance are likely to remain the two main points of contention, shaping South Korean identity views in relation to China and the U.S.
Thank you.
Please.
Well, I'm going to talk about Russia, and I know that the Socialist Asian Studies has been a battle for a long time to get Russia involved in a lot of panels and to understand Russia's role in Asia. But if we talk about the Obama pivot or rebalancing to Asia, we should also talk about the Putin pivot to Asia. Okay. Big discussion of that in Russia, and with Xi Jinping in Moscow now, the economic issues are big front and center, such as natural gas, but there are also other issues, geopolitical issues. Strategic ties are advancing, and important breakthroughs seem to be in progress, discussed in the last month or two, and some cultural ties. And so I'll emphasize the national identity themes that seem from the Russian side, and I think they have a lot of implications for Russian policy to the Korean Peninsula. So while it's Russia placed between China and the United States, it's also Russia conceiving of its broader approach to Northeast Asia. So lately, Putin has picked up the national identity rhetoric. He's come in to overturn the Medvedev discussion of a reset, emphasize the gap with the United States very intensely, said some ambivalent things about China, and some mixed. But we really have to consider three Russian possibilities as China keeps rising, this big neighbor with which Russia, the Soviet Union, had a very serious Sino-Soviet split that transformed the world order from the 1960s to the 1980s. So in terms of discourse, there's a lot of Russian discussion of the United States, led from the top. There's considerably less on China. It's almost as if there's an understanding, don't offend China, from the top leaders, and picked up by many, even though there used to be quite a bit of demagoguery towards China, local governors and others in the late 90s. But that discourse is very unbalanced of late. In terms of the dimensions, all of the dimensions of national identity, and I will go over them, the ones I used, a little different from C1's discussion of dimensions, all of them figure into the Russian discourse on China versus the United States. And the intensity of these national identity themes is really relevant to this third D that I mentioned in my introduction, the dichotomy in the view of United States and Russia, whereas there is very little sense of the dichotomy between China, Russia and China. So the three choices that I would see now for Russia and facing this Sino-U.S. gap is one, to gloat, to say, you gloated when we had the Sino-Soviet dispute, and the Japanese, by the way, have rubbed it in over their territorial issue and tried to take advantage of Sino-Russian differences. And now we can watch as you have all these problems and just cozy up to China and watch you deal with the consequences. So that's problem number one. But if they take this approach, you can see some ability to be less concerned about the Chinese role in Central Asia. Stop talking about the quiet expansionism of China that could potentially impact the Russian Far East. Give Russia some space in Asia rather than putting pressure on it, as China's putting pressure on almost every other state around its borders. Talk about this as an equal partnership, although in fact it's becoming increasingly unequal. The junior partnership, some warn. Appeal for more Chinese investment in the Russian Far East. Highlight the fact that not only is China now Russia's leading trade partner, they have goals to double their trade in just a few years to $200 billion, which is a very large sum for Russia, not so for China. So that's one. Keeping up the anti-U.S. fervor that Putin has been exhibiting, presenting of late, and highlighting the Russian national identity in dealing with this. Option two is to focus back on Russia's theme of multipolarity in the world and try to find ways, and specifically in Asia, try to find ways to suggest that, Russia can keep good ties with China. It's good for the balance of the international order, but it's also trying to maintain some further balance. And that could lead Russia to have a strategy to quietly distance itself from China, make a big deal of relations with Japan. There are already signs in the last few months that Abe and Putin are talking, and there's some movement in ways we would not have expected since 2001, when the relationship deteriorated. We can also see a big gas deal with Japan. Highlighting that maybe more than the natural gas deal that may be announced in Moscow soon. Getting Japan more involved in the Russian Far East development. South Korea would come in here too as some kind of a balancing force. And so this could all be driven not just by Russian thinking, but by Chinese arrogance towards Russia, of which there is some degree, and U.S. patience towards Russia, making it easier for this to happen, rather than sort of responding emotionally to what Putin has been doing and say, okay, we're going to brand Russia as a sort of post-socialist reversion and be tough on Russia, following up the Magnitsky approach. We'll see what happens when Thomas Donovan goes to Moscow soon after the Xi Jinping visit, what the U.S.'s approach. But meanwhile, Syria and Iran and North Korea are issues that may be moving Russia closer to China. They've had that effect to date, and they could have that. Further approach would be to hedge versus China, to go even further in balancing against China. Russia's ties with Vietnam and Southeast Asia are particularly troublesome to China, and there could be other approaches emphasizing more, de-emphasizing the national identity approach, and maybe then having stronger close ties to the United States as a result of this hedging strategy. So these are the options. Let's go over, though, Putin and how he's handled some of these dimensions of national identity. It's sometimes a little hard to get at the Russian debate on China, because as during some other periods, there is relative silence on some of the divergent opinions, particularly in the leadership that we come across. And you do get some Russians at a conference I was at in Korea in December. There was a panel on this issue, and one Russian spoke very positively of ties to the West, and China really is quite insignificant. There's a pragmatic reason to deal with China. And another Russian said, we are so anti-American, and China is our great partner. The relations have never been better. That's more in keeping with the main tone in Russia. It's not the only tone, but it's more in keeping with the recent tone. Okay, on the dimension of ideology, I'll mention that briefly as the first dimension of national identity. Both sides say the United States is driven by Cold War thinking. It's ideological in its approach. And while they're pragmatic, they have to counter this ideology, which essentially says we have an ideological dimension and so on. But in fact, both sides are driven by some common ideological themes that are inherited from the socialist traditional era. And so you get themes like anti-imperialism, very strong, bringing them together. You get themes of socialism in China coming back pretty strongly in the ideological literature related to national identity, and indirectly in Russia, even though they don't specifically say it, they're back to a socialist identity, although the Brezhnev period is now more or less the golden age in Russian discussions of history. And then you got Sinocentrism and Russocentrism built in as a kind of ideological element already. So that's the ideological dimension that drives them closer together. It's hard to see anything in ideology that's pulling them apart. Ideology pulled them very strongly apart in the 60s and 70s, but not today. The second dimension, the temporal dimension, this deals with how they interpret history related to their identity. And both of them focus on what was wrong with Western history over many, many centuries. They're the problem, Russia versus the West. The West has approached continuous conflict and war, unlike China's harmonious tributary system and so on. But beyond that, they come together on the Cold War. They emphasize the other side's problems in the Cold War, and China, Soviet split, not very big deal. Maybe even they made mistakes. U.S. was the problem in the Cold War, and it begins with the Korean War. The emphasis in both countries is how the U.S. was wrong in the Korean War, and de-emphasizing North Korea's attack on South Korea. Rarely see it even mentioned, or not mentioned at all, in sources that are mainly in numbers. There's more diversity in Russia, but I'm talking about what I see as the mainstream coverage. And particularly in the post-Cold War era, it's the U.S. is causing all the basic problems. And China and Russia see each other as very constructive forces in this period. If you go to the sectoral dimension, which is a combination of economic identity, cultural identity, and political national identity, the U.S. threatens both countries in each respect, particularly Russia. Russia sees the U.S. in negative terms in this regard, and China, in the cultural dimension, even more so. The economic dimension, it's only more recently that China has been coming out more directly about the U.S. way of running the world order is seen more negatively. On the vertical dimension was how you see your domestic national order versus the outside world. The U.S. is considered the country interfering in the domestic order, and for Putin, that has been a huge factor of late. So that has helped solidify a common view with China about the U.S. is trying to get regime change in their countries. It's a real threat, and this has become much bigger in China in recent years. And specifically, you can talk the most about the horizontal dimension, international relations, whether in Asia or the world order, and I'll simply say that has drawn China and Russia together from the earliest point of the mid-90s when they found common cause through the strategic partnership, and it's drawn them even closer, and particularly in the last few years, and with Putin's overturning of the reset, it's this international dimension that has been in the forefront. Libya, China and Russia agree, was a dreadful mistake, the UN Security Council. It made a dreadful mistake, and they won't repeat that. Both of them have some guilt to express. So finally, on the in the intensity dimension, I argue that they are so focused these days on the U.S. identity gap and understate their own identity gap, despite the fact there are growing signs of Russian arrogance when they deal with, Chinese arrogance in dealing with Russia, and of Russian concern about some things China is doing, that there are elements of these other two reactions that I mentioned, but it's specifically this intensity of the U.S. gap. And unless Chinese and Russian national identities are changed, not just the gaps, but their identities from the direction they're going, and unless then they can resolve some of their problems with the U.S. and an identity gap, and I don't think for China it's likely at all. So I think the real question is whether that will happen for Russia, whether Russia will have a change, and that's going to be very difficult to achieve right now, but I think it's still possible. I think it's a thing we have to consider. So therefore, I would argue that we're probably seeing the intensification of Sino-Russian ties in the short run, whereas in the long run, I think there are some identity problems that will see a widening gap between the two. I'll close with that. Let me then turn now to, okay, we have no commentator. I'm sure the discussants here will have lots of comments about various things, but I want to turn to the floor because I know there are many people here who will have a lot of knowledge and reactions to what we said. So please raise your hand and ask questions, and then we'll take up maybe 3 questions at a time and get some response. Bob.
Bob Sutter from George Washington University. This has been very illuminating. Thank you very much. I guess I'll address this to Professor Callahan. This looks very startling, this view of China, and yet the South Korean paper by Ms. Byun underlined how this isn't really going to be easily accepted in Asia or even around the rim of China. Now, Gil indicated that, well, maybe Russia might go along with this for a while, but the whole idea of this China model being dominant in Asia is something that I think is going to run across a lot of resistance in the Asian area. And the other point I would just raise is that what are they going to pay for this with? I mean, what are they going to do in substance? Those of us that look at China in the world, first of all, you look at China's attention in the world, 70% of it is around the rim of China. And so the relationships that China has there, they're very conflicted. in a whole range of ways, as indicated in the Korean case. But you go elsewhere, it's the same thing. And yet they have this vision that somehow they're going to be this world leader. And world leadership requires money and commitments and costs. And China doesn't do money, commitment, and costs. They don't do that at all. And so I see a lot of contradictions here. And I see this lofty vision. I see a reality where even Wang Jisi says things are so bad around China that we should look west. You see, because, and he's right. It's terrible. The relationship they have around the rim is very conflicted, and yet that's where it matters most for them. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, if you see what I mean. As far as it's a vision that doesn't have a lot of substance, foreign policy reality behind it. It seems to me, and it doesn't have the oomph of the government, the beef of the government to put resources to actually have some influence in these areas. They tend not to do so.
Okay, question number 2? Yes, please. Identify yourself.
I'm Rozman from the University of Glasgow. My question is really addressed to yourself, Professor Rozman. Russia, as the great power, the former great power, is very reluctant to give up the idea of its own greatness, and China is also has this greatness concept within its identity. When we look at that too, when the chips are down, Russia has not supported China, for example, in its conflict with Japan over the Diaoyu Islands or Senkakus, and similarly, China did not support Russia when it went to war with Georgia to defend the enclave of South Ossetia. So, can we sort of separate the rhetoric from the actions, and perhaps come to sort of, doesn't this give us grounds to be a little bit more skeptical about the prospects for the relationship?
Thank you. Third question. Go ahead, Sergey.
Thank you. I have a comment for Professor Rozman and a question as well regarding China. As for reasons for the identity gap that you mentioned in your talk, I wonder if one thing we could talk about or focus on is the connection to domestic issues. There is this perception in the Russian leadership that the West, or more specifically the United States, is supporting the so-called unsystemic opposition in Russia. And so because of that, there's this demonization of the United States as well as the unsystemic opposition, and there's a connection between them. Whereas China is not doing this, so this may be one of the reasons that Putin is so paranoid about the West and is not particularly concerned about China. So that's a comment I was going to make. And then there's a question that I wanted to make or ask following Professor Sutton's comments, and that is, if we look at where China is trying to sell its vision, it is not necessarily to its neighbors per se. I mean, where is Xi Jinping going after he's been to Moscow? He's going to Africa. China is trying to sell its vision more globally to audiences in the third world. There's a parallel here between what China is doing now and what China was doing in the 1960s. There was such a thing at that time called the Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement, in which China was trying to take a leading role and promote sort of world revolution. Again, not necessarily to its neighbors, but far away. And so I'm wondering if maybe history is repeating itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps there's one comment that will go to one of the other two speakers here, so we can have some more diversity in our responses. Is there another question? Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question.
Wait for the microphone, please. We have a microphone for you.
Thank you. Anna Davis, Hawaii Pacific University, and my question would be to Professor Rozman.
You're about me. I was trying to get someone to one of the other two. I'm sorry. Hold on for a little while then, because we want to get some diversity of responses in our first batch around. Anyone have a question for on Japan or South Korea? Yes. We'll come back to you.
Miles from The Economist. Confucianism and China's appeal to it as part of its identity. I wonder what kind of responses that's evoking in South Korea and Japan as they look at their own Confucian traditions and did they feel resentment of the way in which China is trying to appropriate that particular part of their own traditions?
Okay, please. Bill, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, it's so it's on. Okay. Yeah, the views are startling. They are very startling. I've actually soft pedaled them. They're much more startling than I've narrated today. And I do agree with you that there seems to be not much sense amongst these people who are writing these things and saying them on television that people in Confucian East Asia or in East Asia, Southeast Asia might have a different view or might not look fondly back to the tributary state system that's being kind of re-invoked. I think it's important to take these views seriously, even though they might not make sense in a policy-making arena. It's important to take them seriously because the people that I'm looking at are acting in what I think is quite a new way as public intellectuals. So they're trying to convince not just the leadership behind closed doors, but trying to generate public opinion and generate ideas in public space. So Hu Anggang and Han Wei and Justin Lin are superstars in Chinese media. And so what they're doing is they're creating a sense in China of what is China do, what China will get when China becomes number one, because they assume that China will become number one by 2015 or 2020. And I think this is important because I think it's actually unlikely that China will become the number one power. I don't think that politics works that way, that power is held in Washington and Washington somehow is going to hand it over to Beijing like a baton in a relay race. So what's going to happen when China doesn't actually be a big, huge, influential power in 5 or 10 years' time? I think that will lead to a lot of disappointment and unrest within China, and it's likely that people will blame the leadership, but they'll also blame foreigners, they'll blame the U.S., they'll blame Japan, they'll blame Korea, or whoever. And I think that has a potential of generating unrest both domestically and internationally. So that's why I think it's important to kind of probe these ideas and analyze them and take them seriously, even though they might not make sense at one level.
Do we have a response on Confucianism?
You asked about in Japan. I think a few years earlier, sometimes the Japanese would talk about, they hope for China to exercise power based more on virtue, not on coercion. It's a difference between Bada and Mengdao, right? And now they don't talk about it. Now they basically see China as sort of having middle kingdom syndrome, and this is all a communist country, non-democracy, country doesn't follow international rules. Those are the dominant images. And I don't think people discuss it anymore. This is an emotional time. People just use those terms without sort of thinking about it. They really don't criticize China based on Confucianism, because if you push them, they would probably say, well, the Chinese leaders are not really Confucian ideals of leaders, right? And besides, most people do respect Confucianism in Japan, so they sort of do that. But when I talk about, there are some reformers who actually think about adapting to the Chinese system subconsciously. It's because they are understanding Confucianism, how Meiji period, the Tokugawa period are different. So people understanding Confucianism, a different political system, and with Meiji, they actually came back, decided to converge more with the Chinese system. And now they are talking about Meiji era, and in a way, that's adaptation to the Chinese system. I think this is still a minority view in Japan, but you can see there's room for people to imagine. I don't think it will happen. Right? We're talking about identity. Thanks.
Right, okay. On the Confucian culture, since South Korea is a sort of strong Confucian society, the Confucian culture is sort of the point of shared culture with China, but I think in recent years raises sort of more negative connotations, especially, I mentioned the colloquial history issue, and if you look at public debates, especially in internet forums between Chinese public and South Korean public, the colloquial history issue since 2003, 2004 seems to have sort of evolved and expanded into areas of traditional culture and heritage and sort of who owns various aspects of Confucian culture. But interestingly, these debates aren't between the Chinese and the South Koreans, but like within the Chinese, internet community and then within the Koreans. So there's not much dialogue between the two. I think now the images that South Koreans have is more of China as a rising global economic power, and so China's rise is accepted, but the focus is more on what are the intentions, the positive or negative.
Okay, I'll respond to Neil Monroe's question, and that is, isn't there in the Sino-Russian relationship more of a tension as seen in China's decision in 2008 not to approve of the Russian annexation of areas that are claimed and were originally part of the country Georgia, or the republic before that of Georgia. And China's decision then, although they didn't criticize Russia for the war the way the United States and some others did, was apparently related to their concern that this could justify Taiwan independence. But I think at that time there was a different level of Sino-Russian relations. It wasn't, it's reached a new intensity, and I think that it's possible China would react differently, although that particular test case is unlikely to be repeated. Now, on the other side, I think Russia, in its initial seeming approval of the Chinese position on the Senkaku-Diaoyu territorial dispute, has backed away from it. And so that shows that Russia is, at least with regard to the diversity of its Asian policies, trying to keep the door open to Japan. That would have been such a serious shift for supporting China. There would have been no possibility of any opening with Japan. And my view is that when this issue became hot, Putin was already involved in overtures to Japan. There was already something going on here. And therefore, there was no reason for Putin to give this kind of support to China that would have such serious limitations on Russia's foreign policy in Asia. But I don't regard these two issues as significant enough to suggest the narrowing the national identity gap hasn't been continuing of late. Which brings me to the comment from Sergei that maybe it is highly based on one dimension of national identity, the vertical, which is that Putin is so concerned about the domestic opposition and the challenge to Russia's internal order that he's linking this to the United States and using anti-Americanism to discredit that opposition. And I do agree that the Russian motivation and the national identity approach to the relationship with China has shifted some over the last 15 years from an emphasis on the horizontal dimension of they have a common basis in international relations to the vertical dimension as the most important driving force. But I think all the dimensions matter, and I wouldn't underestimate some of these other dimensions as still driving Russia closer to China than to the United States. On the Chinese side, I don't believe the vertical dimension is that critical. It's always important. It's a big thing, but I don't think it's had that sudden rise to become even more important than as has happened in Russia. But in any case, you can go dimension by dimension, analyze the relationship, and try to examine year by year how the relations have evolved. I didn't discuss in my comments my 20-year overview of the changing role of national identity gaps in China-Russian relations, but I think that would help to answer some of these questions. More questions? Johi.
Charlie Park from Seoul National University. I have one comment and one question to Ming. Your comment about Japan as a bridge and then Japan as an outlier is very interesting. My comment is that I think it depends on the perception about which we may call weak China paradigm and strong China paradigm. Japan perceived it as a kind of bridge between the United States and Japan only when China was when they had a weak China paradigm. They only began after they come to have a strong China paradigm by themselves. So that's the beginning. So the Japan as an outlier is a kind of in-between period when whether China is a weak or strong, they were ambivalent in the early 1990s and some 90s. So that during that period, Japan perceived as an outlier. But after that, their real only began. So and then I think most of the intellectuals in Japan perceive China as a strong nation. Strong China paradigm is there. So because of that, there was many different streams. So some schools say that you have to contain China as against strengthening the relationship with the United States, like Abe, Koizumi, Noda, they are there. Other schools that you have to have a balanced relationship between the U.S. and China, like Hatoyama and Ozawa. So they wanted to make a good triangular relationship, not necessarily as a bridge. But the much more provocative school is like Ishihara saying that stand up against China and don't even think about relying on the United States. You have to have independence capability to deal with China. My question here is that there is a very surprising gap and shortage of any deep engagement school with China in Japan. Nobody is talking about engaging China deeply. So in America, we have deep engagement school. Korea, there's a kind of some school, but in Japan, I can hardly find anyone who say that Japan should engage with China in a very serious manner. So what is your view about why that is the case?
I want to come back to you. I'm sorry. No, go ahead, please.
Oh, my question now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Anna Davis, Hawaii Pacific University, and my question, in my research about effects of national identities of Russia and Japan on their foreign policies, I find a lot of similarities in their national identity, in the way that they're searching. They're confused about their identities, especially after World War II and after Perestroika and Glasnost in Russia. And we're talking about gap in national identity, effects of the gap in national identities. How similarities in national identities affect bilateral relations. And if I can ask the question about Russia and Japan, we're talking more about China and Japan. But overall, what is your perspective on that? Thank you.
Sergey, again, come back there.
Just to add to this, I recently had a conversation with one Russian diplomat who should remain unnamed, perhaps, and he said, we're astounded. We're frankly astounded by the Japanese position. When will the Japanese realize that when they have such a bad relationship with China, that they should tone down the whole island thing with Russia and try to come to terms with Russia, because Russia is the natural natural balance here, as it were. And that struck me as very reasonable. I thought, when will they realize? So I wonder, and I want to put this to both Professor Ming and Professor Rozman, who are both experts in Japan, as well as many other things. when?
Question way back there.
Thank you. My name is Tom Kollega. I'm a Intel analyst with Mandiant, and I had a quick question for William Callahan. To what degree is the China Dream based on building military power, in your opinion? My understanding was that Xi's use of the term is based off of a book that was written by a PLA colonel, and he actually wrote the book with the same title as your book is written, and it's all based on the fact that if China can build enough military power to surpass the United States, it will then achieve the China Dream. Thank you.
Is there any question that will draw Korea a little bit more into this? I'm trying to get the Korea side and yeah, more than that. I think there's a lot of important discussion here. I think people aren't aware enough of how interesting the Korea-Chinese relation is with regard to identity things. But if we have no question right now, well, we can come back to that later. Ming, you want to go first?
Oh, can I ask a question, actually?
Oh, please.
Just to kind of develop some of the other questions. I kind of equipped in my presentation how China thinks it's okay for South Korea to be a kind of a so-so Confucian country. And I'm just curious what kind of debate there is, because China is trying, in some ways, to nationalize Confucianism as a Chinese thing, whereas Koreans, I know, have argued over the years that they actually saved Confucianism from China, first during the Qing Dynasty and then during the Cultural Revolution. So I'm just curious whether that kind of discussion is going on in South Korea.
Another question.
Thank you. My name is Piotr Gibas. I'm from College of Charleston. It's a question. I suppose it's my feeling that China wouldn't like the unification of Korea, and probably they would like to preserve this North Korea maybe opening up somewhat economically, just like using the Chinese model, but still remaining an independent country, because it's my feeling they kind of would like to play North Korea against South Korea and keep it in control. Is that right? Is my assumption correct, or is this just my kind of wrong assumption? Thank you.
Okay. Ming, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Houston. You're right. There was a chronology where I talked about first more focus on operation and more about outlier, and now essentially I see major difference between U.S. and China. And there is clearly correspondence with Japan's soft power position. But I don't want to make a case that this is all about shifting power. And there is a national identity, which is related to Circuit's point. And exactly, right? For example, if you are really thinking as a rational power or realist, why would you want to take on Russia as well? That's very much national identity, right? What I view as more fundamental is the view about Japan's disputes with other countries. It's not just about national interest. It's about honor. It's about a whole set of things. And if you talk about three sort of schools, right now I only see mainly two now. Hatoyama is basic now. I don't think anybody is paying serious attention to it. It doesn't mean that his school of thinking will not come back, but right now it's not. And your question is why don't we see deep engagement with China? And there are people who talk about engagement, right? Because there's all this economic relationship between two countries, the person-to-person relationship. Until the fishing pole incident, you would see people debating about this, and then there would be people who essentially represented that view. But after the fishing pole incident and the nationalization incident, right, and that view essentially is becoming very marginalized. But the dominant view is top position of China. Right? And so I still see there are people who take those views, but it's dangerous for them. I don't know, it's dangerous physically. It can be. That's right. But I see some of them sort of trying to essentially sabotage some of this dominant view on the margin, slowly maybe move into the center of the debate, but it's not happening. They are still here. The dominant view is all how tough should we be on China.
Bill, why don't you go and then say what you want?
Okay, question was how much the China Dream is just about building military power. And yes, there was a book that was published in late 2009 called The China Dream by senior Colonel Liu Ming-fu. But he's not the only person who's talking about the China Dream. In, I think, 2010, Southern Weekly, which is generally seen as a liberal news conglomerate, they gave out about a dozen China Dreamer Awards to public intellectuals, including some liberals and some diplomats and things. So I thought it was a general way of thinking about China's future, rejuvenation of China. Xi Jinping, the way he talks about it, I don't think we can understand it just in terms of building a strong military state in China. He's doing, it's hard to tell what he's doing yet, but it seems that reading his speeches in the past few months, what he's doing is ticking off the various boxes of what Chinese call comprehensive national power. So China has to have a strong economy, a strong military, a strong civilization, and a strong party, and to get rid of corruption. So his various speeches were like, yeah, yay, Chinese civilization, yay, strong military, yay, economic reform. Even though these things might not all go together in a package, that they're often contradictory. I think this is one of the interesting aspects of politics in China now, is that the leadership is trying to juggle all these different groups, whether you call them interest groups or some other name. It's a very interesting situation, because I don't think that you can have all these things at the same time. That something has to give. That's curious.
Okay, so first, again, on the Confucian point, what do you mean by so Confucian?
Oh, because you can't be a proper Confucian if you're not Chinese.
Okay. Well, I guess as I mentioned with the whole debate over ownership within the South Korean debate on Confucian culture, it's something that's South Korean. It's not Chinese. So I think there's sort of a self-conscious separation of the historical factor, and there's also recognition that the South Korean Confucian practices were arguably stronger in the past. And then the unification question. I think this idea of the North Korea as a buffer zone is still very much there. And related to the panel directly before this on which was all on unification, I think China's position has been pretty much consistent on preferences for unification. That it has to be peaceful, decided by both sides, and not imposed by an external power. But I think the more important question for China is not whether or not there's a unified peninsula, but I guess more importantly, what's the political and security strategic orientation, whether or not it's undermines or favorable to Chinese national interests.
The question that still addressed to me focuses on Japan and Russia. And here I would say there are some striking parallels in the evolution of national identity between Japan and Russia, and it is an appropriate comparison to say what happened to Japan in 1945 and shaking up identity so much happened in Russia in a rather similar fashion in 1991, the collapse of the world that they knew. And then how were things similar and different? Actually, there's a project going on in Japan I can tell you about afterwards, we can discuss. And there have been a number of people thinking about these issues, and as I have as well. And it's true that some of the Russians have said, what's wrong with Japan? Why can't they understand that they should deal with us in terms of national interests, not national identities? And then they would wake up to the fact that they need us because of China. They've been saying that with more intensity, and I think that may drive Putin's notion that he can get a breakthrough with Japan now, because he's beginning to see signs that some of the leaders in Japan, including Abe, are thinking in these terms. Although Abe is so obsessed with identity, we'll have to see how it plays out. But there are some interesting changes going on. But that only parrots what Japanese were saying about Russia for many years. Why can't they figure out that China's their big problem, and they need to come to us, and they have to make give us a good deal, give us all 4 islands, otherwise they are in big trouble. So the idea is you don't have to give up your national identity for national interest, but the other side needs to do that. That often is related to the identity gap I was discussing. Questions? Yes. Bring over the mic, please. Yeah. Okay.
Hello, I am Moti from the University of Surrey in the UK. I have one question regarding the different interests, maybe between national interest and party interest. We haven't talked about the CCP yet. I mean, maybe it doesn't fit here very well, but for example, for Korea, the interest, the national interest of China, or for example, United Korea, might be fundamentally different from the interest of the CCP, with the last brother party standing, basically. And also, to Professor Callahan, one question would be that, I mean, Hong Kong is spoken as a small place, but here you can see very startling the difference between national and party affiliation or views of Hong Kong people. They would accept a powerful China and powerful nation, but they fundamentally reject the CCP. What do you think? Can you maybe elaborate about this? Thank you very much.
Question over there.
Sorry, one into the other. Clayton Doobie from the University of Southern California. Bill made the point that the American dream, as articulated by some of the Chinese commentators, is a manufactured thing. That it's something that you create it so as to draw a contrast with it. And the one that's created is of course quite different from what most Americans, if you drop this term American dream on them, how they might see it. And so that's one first point. And it seems to me that that gets at who is Xi Jinping talking to? And you mentioned just now these various interest groups. And this discussion is very much, in China, very much about domestic issues. Bob Sutter raises the point, well, they're not ready to spend. Well, they will buy some symbolic things through stadium diplomacy and these kinds of things in Africa and elsewhere. But what kind of commitment exists? I think it's completely symbolic and completely aimed at a domestic audience. And it's rooted, when you start talking about China Dream, it's rooted in the crisis, this morality crisis that exists in China. And I was wondering if you could somehow address that.
Another question? Sergey?
I'm sorry to be asking so many questions, but this panel is so fascinating, so I've got a question for Professor Callahan. With respect to China, first I wanted to note that you said that China not just wants to be great, but it wants to be greater than the U.S. This is part of the China dream. And that reminded me of a conversation I recently read between Deng Xiaoping and somebody else from 1958. Think about it, very, very long time ago. This is the time of the Great Leap Forward in China. They're trying to make steel in backyard furnaces. Everybody's going crazy. And Deng Xiaoping is saying, well, we made this public announcement that we would like to catch up with the UK. But you know what we really want to do is to actually catch up and overtake the United States. Now, this is something Deng Xiaoping said in 1958. So I'm wondering about this China dream. Is that something that is a Xi Jinping creation, or is it something that goes back all the way back to maybe Deng Xiaoping, all the way back to Mao Zedong? So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, responses, and let's start with Simon.
Question on the distinction between CPC party interest and national interest. So I guess since China is a one-party state, you can reasonably assume that the CPC interest aligns closely with the national interest. But I think one interesting is maybe the divisions within the CPC. within the party towards Korea. For example, the recent assertive voices we heard from 2009 was associated with the more conservative camp and maybe aligned with PLA views as well, versus sort of the reformist camp. But at the same time, I think, speaking of the Chinese model, economic model, the success of the Chinese economic model, especially in North Korea, I think is very closely tied to the legitimacy of the of the China's own regime and party legitimacy. And then the other distinction is the Chinese public opinion, and it's interesting to see recently in response to the latest test that in some Chinese editorials there are arguments for sort of adopting a tougher economic policy towards North Korea in terms of cutting the economic lifeline, which might, that might be a little bit different from previous opinion.
Did you want to add anything?
Just a second. And of course, Chinese national security is fundamentally, first of all, about regime security. They make it very clear it's well founded. But I do want to add that obviously that's a problem. We all agree. But I do want to add that often, not for people who know that, but people outside the field, this vision of a tiny minority hijacking the nation. You have to remember the CCP is a very large organization, has over 80 million people. So, just stop.
And Bill, probably for you.
Okay, so I'll do them in reverse order. My argument is not that the China dream is new per se, but that it's a new expression of themes that have been popular 50 years ago and 100 years ago, especially. But it's still a very kind of modernist way of understanding China's role in the world. And I found another quote, the quote that Dunn was referring to, which Mao gave in 1957, I believe, where he gave the famous quote that China will catch up, it will surpass the UK and catch up to the US in 10 years, whatever that quote is. And it was really fascinating to me how most of the people who I was meeting, whether they are former diplomats, whether they're IR scholars, whether they're economists, whether they're cultural figures, they all point to that quote. And that's very interesting to me because it's a way of saying that Mao is important still, and that we've now fulfilled Mao's ambition, or almost we're about to fulfill Mao's ambition, even though they had to get rid of Maoism to fulfill Mao's ambition. So it's very, to me, it's a very interesting thing. I still haven't worked out what it all means, but there is this fascination with these quotes that come from the Great Leap Forward, which is a horrible, horrible experience. I'm a huge fan. And then there's also a lot of echoes of debates going on around the turn of the 20th century and the new Chinese Republic as well, which again is quite fascinating to me. On to Clay, I think you're right that it's about a morality crisis, and a lot of the people that I've been reading are really worried about the social results of economic reforms and how there are no values, there's no morality in China. And so it doesn't matter whether it's a liberal historian like Su Jilin or the militarist guy, Colonel Liu, they really think that the economic reforms are going too far. And something has to be done. So that is the nexus of the whole China dream, is what is going to be done, and then people come up with different answers for it. You were saying that the kind of rise of China, the China dream, is completely symbolic. I would say yes, but symbolic is important. I know that a lot of people here are realists and will dismiss symbolic politics, but I will defend them and say that they shape a lot of the material policy making that's going on in China, that these reform or not reform comes from people's kind of background beliefs. So the symbols are important. I guess I should answer too much details because I don't have much time. There's another question over here about Hong Kong, and I guess that's the sort of things that I'm interested in trying to employ this distinction between nationalism and statism, or and to say that in Hong Kong they're nationalists, but they're not necessarily statists, whereas in most of mainland China, the people that I'm talking about, at the same time that they're promoting China as a civilization or civilization state, are also promoting the Communist Party and saying that the Communist Party is the key to a strong China, the key to a stable and prosperous China. So they're trying to link the party and the state. They're trying to stop people from